I want to introduce Dr. Mark McPhail. Thank you so much for being here. And he holds an MA from Northwestern University in Performance Studies and a PhD in Rhetoric and Public Address from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And he's an author with decades of academic accomplishments. And the man's brilliant. And if I had to tell you everything, we'd be here all day. In 2021, Dr. McPhail was an up-and-coming leader at the Indiana University of Northwest, and when he was anonymously accused of threatening violence.
The biggest thing that people can connect with here about Indiana University is that this is a blatant attack on academic freedom and due process. And that was one of the things that they were known for a very long time because of the work of Herman B. Wells and the Kinsey Institute, which was kind of the major, event or phenomenon in terms of academic freedom in this country. And they've pretty much they don't even care anymore.
Can you start by telling me a little bit of the demographics of the university?
Gary is, I think, 80%, 90% Black. The comprehensives are basically designed to serve the communities in which they exist. The data show that Indiana University has not served that community particularly well. And Indiana University Northwest campus has the largest percentage of African-American students. Overall, Indiana University is a predominantly white institution.
In September of 2021, 3 police officers from the university came to his home to give him this tenured professor, tell him basically a note saying he was fired effective immediately. And the letter, it said he made threats, and they had no choice but to take it seriously. And Dr. McPhail is now suing the university.
It's not a problem of ignorance. They know exactly what they're doing. They know there's nothing unintentional about this.
They play the innocent card or the...
Right. Yeah. In fact, I actually wrote about that years ago. And interestingly enough, it was at Indiana University. I gave the J. Jeffrey Auer lecture for political communication. And that was the first time that I actually talked about in my work this notion of an ideology of innocence.
They targeted you.
Yep, it was targeted. And I mean, I wrote a letter to the chancellor when I resigned and said, this is what's going to happen. And then it happened. So premeditated, pre-calculated. People were told not to speak to me beforehand, everything.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
So they knew what they were doing.
They knew exactly what they were doing. Yeah. Yep. But my sense is that the culture of Indiana is such that the universities believe they can get away with this. I end up at this institution finally in 2015 as the executive vice chancellor for academic affairs, which is the provost or the vice president. And within months, I resigned because it became apparent to me that the leadership was not sincere in its commitment to diversity, and that it was basically a good old boys club. So when I resigned the first time, the chancellor told me he would stop doing what he was doing, which was basically undermining my ability to get the job done. And then months later, people came and made anonymous complaints and said that they, on the one hand, they were afraid of me. They were afraid to talk to me. And then they said I didn't listen. So that kind of a basic contradiction should have been apparent, but the chancellor had basically enabled this behavior. And during that time, I worked with the Gary Commission on the Social Status of Black Males. And I produced a report that showed how Indiana's public institutions were basically undermining the education of African Americans. And the clearest example was Indiana University Northwest, which Indiana University prides itself as its most diverse campus. But the data showed 13 years of graduation rates for Black students that were under 10%.
So that's kind of what they thought was diversity, just having the people exist.
Having the people, I think just having people on the campus, but not ensuring that they were successful. And clearly the disparities were significant. I was asked to work on a book on the history of diversity at Indiana University by the Vice President of Diversity, James Wimbush. And I had met Dr. Wimbush at the end of my first year when I decided the second time to resign. And I told him about the situation at Indiana University that I was experiencing, and nothing ever happened. So I organized a forum, and in the forum, at least a dozen people from the community came forward and said the exact same thing I had been telling them. They had been mistreated there, that it was hostile towards people of color. And Dr. Wimbush was there. So he contacted me and asked me if I would work on this book. I told him my concerns, and he basically said, no, I just want you to work on this book. It doesn't have to do with your complaint, because I'd filed a discrimination complaint. So I went down to Bloomington for a couple of years, worked on the book, and then the pandemic hit. But at the same time, as I was going down to Bloomington, they had brought David Clayman, who is the dean, who has made these allegations against me, back from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, and where he had been the dean. He came back, and they appointed him to a position as the dean of the School of Arts and Communication. So they combined programs. They appointed him. There was no search. There was no, they didn't comply with any of the policies, their own policies that say what you have to do. One of my colleagues, who was also in communication and had been the department chair, complained about this, and she was fired. So when I got back and I saw this, I complained as well. I documented my complaints, and they were basically ignored. And so I taught for a year, and I was getting ready to teach again, and they basically fired me. Said that I had not been on campus in, I don't know, maybe a month, hadn't interacted with anyone. I spoke with one person, Charlie Hobson, who was ostensibly my friend, but who in fact was responsible for my getting fired. So he made these statements that were interpreted by his boss, who was the dean of the School of Business, whom I had hired. Ultimately, it was the vice chancellor, Vicky Roman Lagunas, and David Clayman, who brought the allegations. It went through 2 faculty review committees, both of which found on my behalf and rejected the institution's position, and then the AAUP report, which came out, which made it absolutely clear that this was done in violation of my constitutional, my institutional, and my civil rights. So that's where we are now. We have a lawsuit. I can't really speak too much about the details in that, although everything that I've presented has been public and transparent. I've hidden nothing. And when they went to the institution, they interviewed people. None of the people they interviewed wanted to be named. Many of them said they were afraid of retaliation.
Absolutely.
And in their assessment, I mean, their own words were, the administration has gone rogue, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, and there is racial hostility on the campus. And then they finally decided they were going to get rid of me because they didn't want to hear these things. That's where things are. And I'm here at Linfield and just trying to do my job and enjoying working with the folks here. So
yeah, and it sounds like you had a kind of a powerful institution working against you.
Well, it was a good old boy club. And I wasn't going to be a good old boy. I received complaints from the other 2 tenured Black professors at the institution from the time that I got there. During the first year. So there were numerous complaints. And Charlie Hobson, who is a person who was, involved in this recent situation, basically wrote a letter that said that he was in the meeting where all these allegations supposedly occurred. And he basically said, I didn't see the meeting that way. He did a great job. He's the heart and soul of academic culture here. I mean, it's in writing. So then I filed a complaint against the institution, and they basically ignored the complaint. And, I was paid less than the person before me, who was a white man. I was paid less than the person after me, who was a white woman.
I read that. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that was going on. And it's pretty obvious to anyone looking at this from the outside that there's a problem here in a number of different ways. But Indiana University doesn't think there's a problem. They think I'm the problem. Yeah, in my assessment, and this is my opinion, I was hired to be a functionary and a token. And it was difficult to understand how anyone could assume that I would be willing to do that if they'd read anything I'd written. When all this stuff happened, people were like, well, what did you say? What did you say? And the only thing I could imagine that I said, and I think that probably, I was working on the book. And I was working on the section in the book about Native Americans. And as Charlie reports it, I said, if they'd killed the white people, then we wouldn't be in this. And it's possible I said something like that, but I mean, I'm working on it's research that I'm working on.
Right, right.
And, I'm having this conversation, and then this turns into me wanting to kill all the white people. It's Rodney King on the floor being beaten by people, and the lawyers saying, look, he's attacking them. It's hearsay, it's innuendo, it's slander. There's no investigation. But these people had it in their minds they were going to get rid of me. Before I got fired, I contacted James Wimbush, who I worked on the book with. I sent him a text, and he said, I have been told by the university not to speak to you. They conspired to destroy my career and my life. And that's why these folks did this, because they believe they're going to get away with this. To this day, they still believe they're going to get away with it. They refuse to acknowledge any of the evidence that's presented. They're just, it's craziness. This is the racist trope, right?
Which everyone can relate to who's white, because we know about that. And
right.
I'm sorry, that's
the whole purpose of why they do this, because they are counting on other white people to say, well, he must be violent.
They really thought this was really a possibility, that you were going to come do something.
No, they fabricated the whole thing.
Yeah, that's
what they did think is, and what they continue to think is, they're going to get away with it.
I want to first of all thank you so much for explaining and taking the time to, and your emotional energy to tell what's been done to you and how you're handling it. What can people who are listening do who want to support you? That's what I want.
The best thing that people could do is to inundate Indiana University's administration with complaints. Indiana University cares more about its appearance than anything. If there's some way of exposing the institution's systemic racism, and bringing and making the administration aware that they are now under scrutiny, not just by the AAUP, but by people who might not, who would not send their children there, who would not work there because of those conditions, that would help.
Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Kim.
Mind
Take care.
Okay.